Okay. Okay, we'll move back up to 6A. The amended Stage 3 Drought Declaration. Mr. Hagemark.
Yes. Let's see if I can get this up. All right, Mr. Chair, Commissioners, here for a hopefully the conclusion of this discussion on turfgrass. We've been talking about this, introduced this in September, kind of leading up to this final amendment to our current Stage 3 drought declaration, and wanting to move forward with new regulations that I think puts the city in the best position to deal with this drought should it continue through this winter. As with past updates, we'll be talking just about the general status, where we are with demands, where we are with our current water supplies. We'll also talk a little bit about our capital projects that we have ongoing, and then looking at our supply strategies, and again, the recapping with the water use regulations that we're proposing. Today's presentation is since we've been doing this over and over and there has been a lot of new information, I'm going to move fairly quickly through this. But if there's any questions at all, please feel free to stop me. Here's the latest from NOAA. It looks like the influence of below average predictions has creeped up and swallowed Santa Barbara, but we're right on the cusp. It's, anyway, at this point, I take all this stuff with a grain of salt, because last year looked like we were supposed to get a lot of rain. So, we're certainly planning for this outcome. This is what we're planning for. Early on in the year, the water year just started October 1st, but we currently are sitting at about 58% of normal at Gibraltar and 48% of normal at the city here. With Cachuma just at 70% of normal. Conservation for October, still pretty strong, 37% conservation, bringing our 12-month running average to 36, which is fantastic. And what we're talking about today is moving that 12-month running average to 40%. That certainly is going to be a challenge as we move into the winter months. If we continue to hit somewhere in the 30 to 35% range, which is still strong performance for the winter, it does mean that when we get into our summer months, we're going to need to be up in the upper 40s in order for our average to be 40%. Lake Cachuma sitting at 7.5% of capacity. I will note, I didn't put it in here, but we did pick up some good press, we call it good press, national press. The Washington Post picked up an article on Cachuma, and I thought it was kind of unique in the sense there were some inaccuracies in the article, but in general, the urgency and the of Cachuma is real, and it was helpful because we haven't gotten much national press since Northern California got rainfall. It's kind of like the drought ended nationally, the recognition. So it was kind of nice to get that recognition. And in fact, I got a call from Dianne Feinstein's office asking what they could do to help. And we certainly have some suggestions, so we're working with them. But yeah, I thought that was, I didn't realize how much it had really fallen off, because in the prior year we were getting a lot of attention and a lot of media inquiries about what was going on. Just to recap, let me be trying to clarify how this will work. There will be water in the lake after December, but that water that remains in the lake is either water we imported or the minimum pool, okay, which is significant. We will not have any Cachuma allocation that we've been able to kind of have in the lake because of our conservation efforts. All that water will have been exhausted, and that goes for all the other agencies too, except for Goleta will have a little bit of water, and it has to do with their Goleta West conduit use. But for all intents and purposes, the only water left in that lake is really state water that's been imported, which is a significant milestone. Still waiting on the county to confirm the new evaporation formula. There was consensus amongst all the member units. We've given all the information to the county, and we're waiting on the county to basically transmit that to the Bureau. The Bureau is basically saying they're on board with it as long as there's unanimous consensus amongst all the agencies, including the county. At this point, I don't know what the county is waiting on. They had asked for a bunch of information. We gave them the information, so I don't know what's waiting right now. But we will continue to follow this. This is a critical to our projections of what's going to be available next year. We are continuing to work with the conveyance, state water conveyance and extension. The design has been initiated, and our water supply manager, Ms. Dyer, has been attending meetings on that. And right now, if things continue to stay this dry, it looks like we may actually need to start construction before next winter, which is a little frustrating. I was hoping we'd be able to get at least into next winter and potentially another opportunity, if need be, to delay that. But that is going to be a several $million project to extend the pipeline roughly 2 miles from the dam to the barge. But that effort is underway, and the consensus right now is that COMB will be the lead with that project. That's some interesting pictures taken by USGS, kind of showing the lake in 2001 and then in 2016, and it's somewhat difficult, and if I had better skills here to kind of overlay them, but just showing here's where Tecolote, the tunnel, North Portal is. Here's where it is today in reference to what's remaining in the lake. Here's the dam. These are roughly at the scale. So you can just kind of see just how much the lake has retreated. Normally our intake is about halfway through the lake. Just a quick update on the draft order. We're continuing to work with CCRB on a response to that. There was an extension granted, and comments are due by December 9th. Once those comments are submitted, that will be anticipated to share it at the same time that we submit it to the state. We'll be submitting it to the Council and the Water Commission as well, so we'll share that with you. Gibraltar, currently sitting with 0 acre feet. 0% of capacity for those who struggle with math.
Oh, I got a question. Did we get any silt runoff in any of the last rains at all? Or
No.
Yeah, okay.
No.
There's not if anything came in at all, but
The watershed is so dry, it didn't make it anywhere. Yeah.
okay.
We figure we need roughly 10 inches of rain before we're going to start to see any runoff, and that's based on depending on how it comes in. If it's 1 10-inch storm, and probably runoff before that, but if it comes in 1 and 2 inch increments, it'll take 10 inches before the ground will be saturated enough. Unfortunately, there's an index that they use in the backcountry to kind of measure how dry things are. And the recent inch that we did get back there was helpful, but then we had the 80 and 90 degree temperatures, which quickly pushed that drought or that dryness index back up again to the point that we had a red flag alert yesterday and today, so it's certainly not a good sign. We did complete the downstream water right release, which brought our account for the Jinchao water down to 0, so there's no owed water sitting in the lake anymore. And with the lake empty, since it hasn't been empty since the 90s, we thought we'd jump in there, and we are going to do some assessment of some of the valves that are more difficult to access when there's water in the lake. And if there's any needed repairs, we're going to go ahead and make those. We do have a much more significant project we would like to do in the lake, but at this point, given our financial situation and the fact that those repairs we believe can be done when the lake has water in it, we're still holding off on that. So we are planning for higher than normal runoff because of the burned watershed. There should be less vegetation, so We're hoping that when we do start to see some rain, we could see something earlier than normal. But of course, with that, it's going to come sediment and probably debris from the fire. Just to quick recap on this imported water, we were very successful this year at securing over 7,000 acre-feet of water. That water sits in San Luis Reservoir and is being delivered every single day, keeping the state water pipeline coming into Santa Barbara County and into Cachuma full. We are planning in 2017 for 35% allocation, which may be too conservative given that Northern California is sitting so well. So we may look at that again, but it really doesn't change our outlook in the sense that we have sufficient water going into 2019 already, so that just changes that outlook. If we were to get a 65% allocation this next year, it just means we would have water to keep that pipeline full out into 2020. That's really how it, I get a lot of questions about when we get more snow in the Sierras, does that help? No, because we've been so successful already at basically acquiring water. We've got sufficient water to keep that pipeline full. Groundwater wells, nothing new to add from last month. Our groundwater basins are both sitting roughly at about 30% of remaining capacity. We expect at the current pumping rate that it's about a year and a half's worth of water, but likely as it gets lower, those pump volumes will start to decrease. So it's probably 2 years of groundwater pumping that we expect to still have in the basins. But when we start talking about desal, which I'm going to get to this earlier, it's really going to be to start to replace this supply. As this supply starts to fall off and our water supply situation isn't improved, that's where desal starts to play a role. Mm-hmm.
So for a couple years, we were talking about groundwater wells quite a bit and replacement, and it seems like everything's good. All the wells going fine now. Are we in a good spot? Do we take care of that?
We are. I called it well hell. We just wells are very difficult and can be finicky, particularly the way we operate our wells. Typically during wet times, we rest our groundwater basins because they're small, and we try to keep them available for droughts, and so they had been offline for a long time. But so far, everything's been online, and it's not due to staff have been very attentive to issues trying to keep them upline, and you'll see that in the production numbers this month. We do assume some level of wells being offline, and in the last month things have all been clicking, which has been wonderful. Desal, lots of stuff going on right now, and as I mentioned, this month is really kind of critical for the schedule. They're working offshore. That's where our major focus is right now. And the barge showed up on October 26th. This is the barge that's setting all the equipment, intake equipment out there, the pumps, the screens. And on Tuesday was a major milestone. In order to tie in, there's an existing pipe that we put in the 90s that goes out there. It's a high-density polyethylene pipe. And in order to connect the intakes, we needed to connect to that. Well, when they did it in the 90s, they just poured a big old chunk of concrete around it. It wasn't really the prudent method for connection, and so we removed that concrete, are kind of cleaning up some of that issue, and this has been some of the challenges out there. How do we connect to these two pieces of pipe underwater? If it was on top of above the water, they could weld it, and or they would do this mechanical, it's called a Victaulic connection, where they basically put a groove in the pipe and there's a clamp that holds it together. Welding is not an option underwater, the way that process works, but the grooving process had never been done underwater, and in particular never been done under seawater. And we were able to convince a company to take a stab at it, and lo and behold, they came up with the equipment to do that. And on Tuesday, it was completed. And that was one of the major milestones that we were nervous about. Because if that didn't work, we were going to have to go back to the 1990s method of pouring concrete down there, which is rather complicated. So that was completed. We're still not out of the woods yet, but that certainly puts us on a target to being able to start receiving seawater in mid-December. So that's our goal, is to start up and testing. As I mentioned before, there's roughly a 40-day maturation process where we need to pump seawater onshore through our media and basically build up like a biofilm on the media that actually allows it to be an effective filtration. So we're currently on schedule for a mid-February to late March production. And as I mentioned, there's still a lot of vulnerabilities out there, but I'm trying to keep the public and commission and council informed as this thing moves along. But extremely complicated project. Mm-hmm.
So what are a couple of those things you're most concerned about going forward?
Well, we still have to complete the work in the ocean, and certainly storms, tide surges, and water clarity are a problem. In fact, we've been working with the waterfront, who's getting ready to basically clean out the opening to the marina there, and that potentially in the past has reduced visibility, and so we're working to negotiate to push them back, hopefully into late December when we've finished all of our work. But dredging, could stir up the bottom. That kind of stuff reduces things to zero visibility, and then work just basically comes to a screeching halt. So it's just a sensitive time out there. There are things going on the construction site at this point, but we got power to the site now, and so we believe that'll all come together. And then you have the process of basically getting all the equipment through startup. And since this design has been used at other locations around the world, we have a higher level of confidence. But it is a very tight site, and there's a lot of it's a very technical process to clean up seawater. So just cautious about that.
How much work is actually remaining onshore, like on the site at the plant?
More than I would like there to be. That's one of the things that we're working with the contractor on. Their contract completion date was October 4th. Yes, we've had some unforeseen issues, which we have talked about, contaminated soils and the transition pieces that got into the ocean. But having said that, some of the timeline doesn't excuse some of the other delays with stuff that was unaffected by that. And that's been some of our challenges, why isn't some of this stuff done? And so we've been working closely with them on that. And they're continue to assure us that this is not going to be holding up the project from meeting its current deadline. So, as I mentioned last time, we are continuing to work on desal plans for desal expansion. This is certainly not something I'm excited about, in the sense that it means significant additional costs. But I think given the unprecedented nature of this drought, I don't think we can just ignore our planning on this, because our groundwater is not going to hold out forever. And I think we need to start thinking about, how we would replace that supply should it start to diminish. And so we have started that effort, picked up that effort again, and are looking at the treatment costs. We transmitted to IDE basically a cost sheet for them to start pricing out expansion options, whether that's adding 1 skid, 2 skids. We're looking at these different alternatives for expansion. At this point, we don't know what we're going to need, but kind of wanting to get that cost information hopefully in early January, February, so that we can start to use that information to make an informed decision in late winter, early spring.
The connection between the desal and groundwater, clearly we're right on the edge of starting to pull seawater into the to basin, downtown basin. This is sort of a long shot, but would be there any possibility of either pumping the USGS monitoring wells, or putting a well in right along the coastline and pumping out the seawater that's intruding there and putting that water into the desal plant?
Well, so our Sentinel wells that we have out there are really small, but we did explore as part of the feasibility study what could be done with beach wells, and it just based on the hydrogeology, it was fairly limited, the production we could get out of those wells. So
No, I don't mean beach wells in the sand there. I mean actually down in the aquifer where the chloride's intruding.
to try and reverse the direction of flow, is that what you're thinking?
Or just stop it there and put that water into the desal plant.
We can talk about that. I'm not. You probably know more than me. Will that accelerate seawater moving in, or would that actually help slow things down? Yeah.
I don't know.
Might get some influence on that, bringing the water in.
Worth exploring.
This question on the expansion, if we do move forward with that, is a lot of the underground infrastructure in place already, or is there still a lot of work there that would need to be done?
A lot has been done to size the facility for up to 10,000 acre-feet a year. The pumps offshore, the screens offshore are all set for the larger facility. The intake pipe is all set for the larger facility. What we understand at this point, and that's what IDE is giving us costs for, is the additional treatment skids would be required, but also probably some additional tankage on site for storage of chemicals and things like that. So to that extent, the major infrastructure is there to accommodate it. The one thing that we would need to address, which we've talked about, is the conveyance. As we get above 3125, the challenge is how do you convey that water throughout the city? Right now, we're kind of relying on pushing that water into our distribution system and kind of working it backwards, which is not ideal. And that's one of the reasons we've been working on this conceptual design of how we could move larger quantities of desal water around the city, and in particular getting it to all parts of the city. So we're continuing to work on that effort. I'm hoping to have confirmation, I'm told, before Thanksgiving that the concept that we're working with will work, and then they're going to get us some pricing on that in December. That will be a major milestone, and I think we'll be back to talk about that with Water Commission and looking to keep them moving on the design. I think it has potential value to the city long term. Even at 3125, this conveyance pipeline could be helpful in allowing us to, I think, the entire city to benefit from the water quality of desal. So schedule, we are working towards having enough information to make some decisions in early spring, with the idea that if we needed to expand the facility, we would be looking towards awarding some construction contract in summer of 2017. July timeframe is kind of what we're thinking. We have been working, I skipped over funding, we have been continuing to pursue trying to get some grant funding. Proposition 1, which was passed by the voters in 2014, set aside almost $100 million for desal projects in California. They have yet to issue a penny of that yet. It's been one of our frustrations. I've been talking with them now for about a year and a half, and they haven't even gotten the guidelines for the grants out there. And unfortunately, what they're talking about on their end is that any funds spent prior to award of the grant would not be eligible. And I don't know why they're moving slowly on it. Should punish us because we've been prepared. We had a plan. I feel like we're unfairly being punished because we kind of had our act together from the beginning. But needless to say, we continue to push on them, and this is one of the locations. There are places where I'm trying to see if Dianne Feinstein's office can see if they can't push DWR to. At this point, all I'm asking is for the opportunity to compete for this funding. There has been opportunities in the past where DWR has set the eligibility date to the passage of Proposition 1 and said any project done after the proposition was passed, which our project would qualify, then we could at least compete for that funding. We have, I believe, have very good cost accounting that would make this project pretty easy to reimburse costs. And then there's state revolving fund loan. I just had a meeting with the folks with the state board on this, and really pleased with the fact that they are engaged in wanting to help. Again, their process is rather arduous. It takes about a year to get an SRF loan, but they seem keen on trying to help, particularly with any expansion. We're talking about amending our current SRF loan to cover any of the expansion costs, which is extremely helpful. But then also we would have to get another loan to cover the conveyance costs, because that project wasn't described in the original loan. So, but they seem eager to try and help meet our timeline of making that funding available by July. And so we're going to start down that path. That would allow us to not have to use, I'm just guessing the conveyance system might be about $5 million. We wouldn't have to take that from reserves or potentially take it from the water main fund to make that happen. So continuing to explore options there. It's getting tight, and obviously recognize the rate sensitivity associated with some of these major costs. Recycled water plant. Mm-hmm.
I'm not hearing anything about our state representatives. It's Feinstein's office, but this was a state proposition, right?
Yes.
So have they been engaged, and have you gotten any? What have been their participation in this?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember White, we did engage them a while back on this, and it didn't seem of grave interest. Given the worsening condition, I think it's definitely worth reaching out and asking again. I do think there's some hesitation to desal expansion related to its environmental impacts that makes it, something that we've had difficulty getting support from our representatives.
Okay. Thank you.
Recycle water plant, we are currently out of service right now. We had a failure of the filter feed piping. Our expectation is that we'll be able to make these repairs and have it back in service, I'm hoping in early December. Staff is working quickly to get an emergency purchase order, and the contractor that's currently on site working on the secondary aeration basin has agreed to tackle this. It's technically not overly complicated, but resolving what caused the problem is certainly going to take some significant analysis. At this point, we're planning to put back in how it was designed and constructed, but we believe there may be some flaws in how that was put together initially. And at this point, we don't know what the cause is. We don't know if it's manufacturing of the pipe. We don't know if it's an inadequate supporting of the pipe. But basically, the pipes that were there, which are made out of PVC, began to show signs of cracking due to some type of pressure, internal pressure issue. So the pipes are actually pretty low pressure. They operate at about 50 psi, so it's rather surprising to see this pipe, which I believe is rated at about 200 psi, starting to show signs of cracking. And at the time, show potential threat to safety for staff. Fortunately, when it did go, there wasn't anybody around or within proximity of it, but we're sensitive to making sure that staff are protected in the future with that as we begin to start to understand what it is that caused it. We have reached out to our larger customers, Parks being one of them, and asked them to temporarily reduce their demands so that we can reduce our potable water going into the system. Recycled water has been on the decline due to the just natural seasons changing, shorter days and cooler nights. You need a lot less water. We're currently, demand is at about 0.8 MGD, or about 2.5 acre feet a day, and we do have the Valverde well online, and it is helping to offset some of those demands right now.
So I know demands aren't high right now, but where are we with the process of getting, aside from this issue, the plant where it should have been or where it should be producing based on design, and then also in the discussions with the design firm that we've been having?
Yes, so we've made great progress with basically the two, we call them subcontractors who designed the treatment facility. They have been working closely with staff, and we believe we have a plan. It's now a matter of kind of getting everything together and implementing that plan. But the goal is to get the capacity issues resolved by next summer, prior to next summer. But there are some issues that need to be worked out, and items will be going to council to discuss the legal issues of that. I believe it is going to council next Tuesday. I forget if it's in closed session next Tuesday or if it's actually going to the full council for discussion next Tuesday.
Well, the closed session started last
night.
Yeah.
Okay.
So day before yesterday, and it's obviously the city is not happy with the performance, and there is definitely. I mean, we have our attorney here. Maybe you could comment on where that might be better for our legal staff to comment on it rather than me.
Sarah Connect, Assistant City Attorney. I'm not involved in this particular matter, so I've not been briefed by our other legal counsel, so I'd rather defer until I've had a briefing so I could bring you up to date on that. But I do know that it was considered by this in closed session Tuesday night. So I'll just defer until the next session on that. Thank you.
So I would expect it would be coming back to council shortly then if they had the closed session discussion. So, So current water supply mix, we've gone over this in the past few months. What we're currently focused on, this is our projected monthly demands going out. You'll see the mixture of our various supplies. And then, of course, desal coming online in February. Conservation being kind of this white area here. And then what we've recognized right now in August, September, and October without significant rainfall, we were recognizing a shortage, which amounts to about 300 acre feet late this summer. This is currently what the storage looks like in Cachuma, with basically finishing up the remaining carryover water we have in Cachuma and then relying this little bit here being state water importing into the lake. And so trying to address that shortage.
I got a question. Mm-hmm. Going back to your slide, that slide or the previous slide, Josh, on the monthly allocations. Desal you've got coming in February. If there is a 1 or 2 or 3 month delay in that, what's our contingency there?
And that's exactly why I'm asking for more than 300 acre feet as part of this turf grass ban. I think planning for worsening conditions is prudent. And so we're looking for roughly 800 to 1,000 acre feet out of this turf grass band, even though we have identified 300 right here. So it's basically to head that off. February is kind of an interesting month. If desal comes on in February, we actually need to shut down our groundwater wells in Storage Unit 1 because we will not, demands are lowest in February, and we will not have the ability to move that water out of the low zone. It's particularly just the January, February timeframe. So February is kind of this weird transmission month. If desal's on, our wells won't be. If desal's not on, our wells will be. So it ends up being a pretty minor difference if we have to move it out to March. But that is something that transmission main, the conveyance pipeline, would help address that issue of just not having the ability to get enough water out of the low zone at that point. Our water supply strategy here, and
Mr. Chair. So, is there any opportunity to partner up with Montecito on that, where Montecito has the ability to use low zone desal water? And is there any small. I mean, I know we do some overlapping with both Goleta and Montecito, but we're just throwing that.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember White, we could explore that again, but as I recall, it's pretty minimal, our connection with Montecito, so it wouldn't benefit us. Yeah, and typically that's when their demand is really low as well. So, it's kind of a short-term issue, and I think getting that conveyance system in will be helpful. Sorry, bouncing around here. Here we go. So our current supply strategy, this is with moving forward with the turf grass ban, is a 40% conservation target. That's what we're hoping to move the community towards. This will allow sufficient water then to meet all of our needs this year and going into the future. What we're kind of struggling with when we look at this graphic is we've made some projections here. This yellow is our groundwater production. We believe this to be accurate, but this certainly can turn quickly if we start to see seawater intrusion. And so this is the supply, in essence, that we'd be looking to basically make up with desal if that were the situation. And basically by getting the 40% conservation, we're able to shave off that shortage that we saw in August, September, and October. So to get there, we are recommending increasing our conservation to 40%. And to do so, some additional regulations which require the use of recycled water for construction activities. Right now there is construction activities that are close to the recycled water system, but what we're saying is all construction activities. We did some calculations, and most, I think pretty much the entire city is within a mile of our some connection to our recycled water system, so we don't believe that's an undue hardship to have to use recycled water for dust control and soil compaction. But the big regulation change, and in your packet is the draft or final resolution that we're looking, and it shows the red lines as to what we're changing, but it includes a ban on all turf grass watered with potable water. And we do have some exemptions that we've talked about before, which are recreated areas, particularly at schools and parks where there's active recreation, golf course, putting greens, watering of certified water-wise grasses, which we have been providing rebates on and use a fraction of the water that normal grass uses. And then also recognizing that there are probably commercial uses of turf where an exemption may be applicable. And in those cases, they would have to submit for an exemption to the Public Works Director, and we would be looking at each one of those individually with an eye on them meeting the 40% conservation target if they're going to water certain grass. We also got some feedback from council at the last meeting that they wanted to have the ability for hand watering. And we've talked about it. It's kind of challenging because hand watering is not really something you're going to keep your lawn, most lawns looking good with hand watering. It's a time intensive and kind of a waste of energy and water. But what we, I think, wanted to recognize there is there may be something we haven't thought of, an exemption that would be legitimate. And so wanted to let the commission know that within our current regulations, the Public Works Director does have the authority, should there be an undue hardship or special need. I can't think of any right now, but there is a process by which folks can come in and submit a request, and it will be reviewed.
Let's just say that's a minority position on council. That's my view anyway. So just to reassure the commission that's my belief is it's not a majority view on council for that.
So the schedule, we'll be taking the new regulations to council on December 6th. and we are currently recommending that take effect January 1st. There are some staffing changes we need to make internally to gear up for it, and we believe it's prudent because it puts the city in the best possible position going forward. And of course, if we get some significant rain, we can make some adjustments as necessary. So before you today is a recommendation that council adopt an amended resolution establishing a revised water use reduction target and an updated water use regulations effective during a stage 3 drought emergency.
We've had this before us now a couple times, and unless there's a lot further discussion, I'd like to recommend that the Water Commission recommend to council the adoption of the draft resolution.
And I'll second.
Mr. Chairman, I'm reluctant to raise this subject, but nowhere in here does it mention the ongoing construction activities. I think the Washington Post article recommended or recognized that that's at least a public relations problem, and as we've discussed in the past, the amount of water that's involved is very minor, so it's more of a perception problem than a real water supply problem. But I wonder if it would be worth somehow extending public relations somehow as part of this process to recognize that is an issue and that we think it's not a problem, if we can confidently state that.
Everybody looked at Bendy.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, I would ask that you make those two separate motions that just segment these. I happen to support that concept, but I don't. That still is in the gestation stage at council. But and I think
I didn't really mean that to be a motion. I was just wondering if there's some way that it ought to be incorporated in this particular thing, which is amended stage 3 drought declaration, and doesn't mention it at all.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Keller, the plan right now, unless the commission would like us to do something different, is we will revisit development in the spring. We will, as we've done every spring, we will bring back that issue. And again, it is a small amount of water, but if things continue to worsen, I think it's something that we need to continue to discuss. Because there is a perception issue that goes along with it. So that is the current plan, is to bring this back for further discussion unless there's a desire to bring it back before that.
That's fine with me, and I don't want
well,
to
I would just say, because again, many of us have that concern. The idea to segment the motions is the correct one, right? If there's a second motion, again, we have a motion on the table, but just talking to a separate motion would be asking the staff to, in the council presentation, to address that issue publicly, so that in fact it isn't just simply silent at this point, but reflects our previous discussions in what we're going to do. So that would essentially be a second motion, just asking staff to report on that issue as part of your report to council on Tuesday or when this goes up in December. That makes sense.
So procedurally, where does that put us right now?
We have a motion on the table relative to recommend council adopt the resolution as is.
Okay.
Okay. Do we want to move forward with that at the moment? Okay. We'll take a vote on that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Nay. Okay. So that passes. Do we want to make a second motion?
Yeah, I'll make a second motion that we ask staff in their presentation to council when it goes up there on December 6th to address the status of addressing new development and the water demand for new development at this time, and the procedure we're going to have to reassess that in the spring. So that would be just asking staff to address that in their verbal presentation to council, or actually they could do it even in the council agenda report. There is time to get that in there.
I'll second that one.
Okay. I will. Any comments on that? Questions? Or okay, we'll take a vote on that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Opposed?
Thank you.
Okay.
Before we move off that, I just want to, I will be out of town on December 6th, but I'm wondering if somebody else from the Water Commission might be able to go to the City Council meeting and help represent what we discussed over the past year plus on this issue.
I could do that.
Thanks.
Oh, time out. I cannot. I will be gone on that date also.
Okay.
I don't think I'll actually be in town on that day either. I will check my calendar, and if I am here, I will definitely.
Back to you,
attend.
Joshua.
Did I hear Commissioner Jordan was?
So moved.
Mr. Chair,
Okay.
I have a question before we move off this package. Could you tell us what the impacts of this delay, are there any impacts on the evaporation issue is now held up at the county? Are there what are the implications of that question still just staying open at this point, if any?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner White, at this point there isn't any repercussions. What was agreed to was that effective January 1st, all water remaining in the lake would take on its own evaporation. If that equation doesn't change, starting January 1st, all evaporation for the entire lake, including the minimum pool and the water being stored in there by downstream users, would be taken out of the small amount of state water that's being delivered to the lake. And at that point, you're basically going to see that state water diminishing quickly as we try to put it in there. It'll be lost to evaporation. And so it makes a big difference on where we stand next summer. It's not an immediate issue, but it will build up. It'll just continue to eat away at our deliveries to the lake. And so come January 1st, it needs to be in place.
Thank you. And so then what you're saying is then the minimum pool doesn't take evaporation now, and what the notion going forward is that the minimum pool would share, and since that's most of the water in the lake, the minimum pool would start to take its proportionate share of evaporation.
That's correct.
Okay. And then secondly, can you give a couple more words on the repairs to Gibraltar that you said could be done, that could be done when the lake is full, but just what are you, what's in the back of your mind there?
Yeah, so we're looking at the intake gates. You imagine Gibraltar is a shell of what it used to be, and there's basically gates, I forget, every 15, 20 feet that go down, and I'd say probably of the 6 to 8 gates that used to be in there, there's probably 2 that are above the mud line now. The rest have all been buried. And so it's a matter of maintaining those gates, because as we, in particular, should those be able to fail close, we can't get water out of the lake, and fail open, we are unable to regulate how much water is being diverted either downstream or to the city. And so being able to get in there and do some maintenance on those gates is important. Particularly the lowest gate we did, I think after the last drought, we put in what's called a snorkel. And so on the valve, before it got buried with silt, we put on this hose that basically comes all the way up to above the mud and above the surface of the lake. And we would basically drop that down in the lake. And then if we wanted it to stop, we pull the hose back out of the lake. And so that's basically our method of pulling water out below the mud line. But doing some maintenance on that, some of the stuff, it's a lot easier to get to and maintain when there's no water in the lake. So yeah, just kind of addressing that. We've looked at this before. There's roughly about I think it was scoped out at about $1 million project to go in there and completely redo all of our valves in there, and that's just not in the cards right now. It's not something we can tackle, but I think there's things that we could do to keep it in a decent state of repair such that we could ensure those critical operations can function.
Sure. If, in fact, the expensive pipeline to the barge for state water gets built, presumably that would eliminate evaporation of the state water.
It does eliminate it, but we run into that challenge of we still need to store water in the lake, in the sense of how do we meet those peaking needs in the summer. In the winter, it's fine. We pretty much could use that water directly, but we run into that peaking issue that we really do need to have a place where we can store water As I mentioned, we need to be able to store roughly 700 to 1,000 acre-feet of water by May to really help us to meet those peaking demands throughout the summer. And so it will be interesting. I mean, we're talking about we're going to have to do further water restrictions if we get down to the point where we're relying on a direct connection to the state water project.
Mr. Chair, going back to the Commissioner's burning question about the council, I forgot. I actually attended the last meeting and actually went through with the council all of our discussions previously. So they've actually had a briefing on what we've been talking about. I totally spaced it, but.
All right, excellent. Thank you. And I want to thank council in advance for their support on this. It seems there's favorable support for it, and I think that's great. I'm looking forward to see how this helps us out next spring. So, all right, we will move on to item number 6.